Streaming live to you today. This is I Need Living Conversations. This is what the 168th conversation that Blue Heron Woman and me, Julian Katari, have over so many different subjects regarding the evolution of mankind and the valiant project to overcome the really deep stupidity where mankind is standing on right now. And we're going into the deep abyss of the system, the many parts of that system, the many factors, the many ways that it operates. And it's a very important thing to know this so that we can avoid it and so that we can be conscious and that we can understand how we are participating in something, even if we don't realize it. So that's why this is important. And welcome everyone to I Need Living Conversations. Welcome, Blue Heron Woman.
Yeah. And it's not so much a matter of avoiding it, it's a matter of saying, no, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to repeat this because it has repeated for thousands of years in different forms.
Mm-hmm. So find a way to not participate.
Right. And to stop it. Just say, stop. We're not, no more tolerance for this. We're going to bring an end.
Tolerating it. Yeah.
So, which incidentally, since today, Happy New Year, Happy Chinese New Year to everyone. We're into the year of the wood snake now, and wood is creates fire. Mm-hmm. Snake is there. So there's my elements are still not. But there's wood and fire there, so we could see lots of fires this summer with this wood snake.
Right.
Here, but it's also in another ancient Chinese divination book. It relates to the 49th hexagram of the I Ching, which is a revolution.
Okay, so a revolution is happening this year?
It will happen this year. Mm-hmm. And part of the picture of the ideogram of this 49th hexagram is that of a skin spread out, which the female shamans of China wore skinned. So this female is going to wear the skin of the revolution of enough of this bullshit. With aloha, with adult, self-regulating, not self-governing, self-regulating. That way nobody thinks we're anti-government. Mm-hmm. Right. Self-regulating, kinship, inclusive kinship, ranching enterprises. So
amazing. Mm-hmm.
So, where did I don't remember where we stopped last time with the corporate machine. Mm-hmm. Number 7, there's 11 rules for it that it goes by. So number 7 is dehumanization. As the environment and the community are objectified by corporations, so is the employee objectified and dehumanized. Corporations make a conscious effort to depersonalize, and I can speak for that from the military corporate machine. Absolutely. It was the most annoying thing for me when I was first in the Navy to be constantly called by my last name. That's one way of dehumanizing.
Wow.
Yeah. It's like, no, that's not my name. My name is Ingrid.
And some people like that.
Yeah.
Some people like to be called doctor or
by their title. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So corporations make a conscious effort to depersonalize, which is hospitals too are corporations, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, everyone is doctor. That's why doctor, nurse, doctor, right? It's not personal. Mm-hmm. So, and in the great majority of corporations, employees are viewed as ciphers or cogs in the wheel, replaceable by others or machines. Exploitation. All corporate profit is obtained by a simple formula. Profit equals the difference between the amount paid to the employee and the economic value of the employee's output, and or the difference between the amount paid for the raw materials used in the production and the ultimate sale. So Karl Marx was right in this, that a worker is not compensated for the full value of his or her labor, and neither is the raw material supplier. So the owners of the capital skim off part of the value as profit, and profit So profit is based on underpayment all around except to the stockholders and the shareholders this is called exploitation to the max. Number 9, ephemerality. Corporations exist beyond time and space, and they're not really beyond time and space. They're not, because they exist only on paper. They have no commitment to locale employees or neighbors. The traditional ideal of community engagement is antithetical to corporate behavior. Number 10, opposition to nature. Though individuals working for corporations love nature, corporations themselves and the corporate societies are intrinsically committed to intervening in altering and totally transforming nature into commodity products. Metals from the ground are converted into cars, trees are converted into boards, then houses, oil is converted into gas and energy, and all manufacturing activity depends upon the intervention and reorganization of nature. In capitalist corporate societies, the process is accelerated because capitalist societies and corporations must grow at all costs. The consumption cycle is also being accelerated as corporations have an intrinsic interest in convincing people that commodities, stuff, bring satisfaction. But the net effect is the ravaging of nature. Number 11 is homogenization. American rhetoric claims that commodity society delivers greater choice and diversity than other societies. Choice in this context means product choice. Choice in the marketplace. Many brands to choose from and diverse features on otherwise identical products. Corporations have a stake in all of us living our lives in a similar manner, achieving our pleasure from things that we buy. All corporations share an identical economic, cultural, and social vision and seek to accelerate societies and individual acceptance of that vision. Lifestyles and economic systems that emphasize sharing commodities and work, that do not encourage commodity accumulation or that celebrate non-material values, are not good for business. The nuclear family is a far better idea than a tribe for maintaining corporate commodity society, because each family lives alone in a single family home and has all the same machines as every other family on the block. And now the single person has proved even more productive than the nuclear family, since each person duplicates the consumption patterns of every other person. And this is now being pushed by Joe Dispenza. I'm pretty sure he's not conscious he's doing it, but he is. Because in his video, which actually was very empowering to me, about why women who live alone are the most magnetic, powerful women. I'm going to say a woman who lives alone in the city is not a powerful magnetic person at all, because there ain't shit to cope with in the city. A rancher woman who lives alone and ranches by herself, like I do, I finally realized it brought me to the fact that how powerful and magnetic I am. Because of all, and that science proves that when you problem solve by yourself, you grow new neural networks. Neuroplasticity. But now he's pushing this, saying women who live alone are the happiest people in the world. Right?
They're all brain trapped somehow. All controlled.
Yeah.
If they're famous, it's like you gotta.
If you're famous and not being deplatformed.
Yeah, that's it.
There's a reason why.
Yeah.
Because somehow you're singing the tune they want you to sing. So now that we see the inherent direction of corporate activity, we must abandon the idea that corporations can reform themselves or that a new generation of executive managers can be re-educated. We must also abandon the assumption that the form of the structure is neutral. Corporations and the people within them are not subject to moral behavior. They are following a system of logic that leads towards dominant behavior. To ask corporations to behave otherwise is like asking an army to adopt pacifism. So this brings us into the corporatist society that we all partake in and so proudly, even every spiritual teacher promote. 3 decades of erasing and remaking the world and more. Capitalism's shock doctrine. Where that came from, I don't know, but I feed a lot of hay, so.
Yeah, sometimes you get something stuck in your throat. It's pretty common.
So Milton Friedman, grand guru of the movement for unfettered capitalism and the man credited with writing the rule book for our contemporary hypermobile global economy. In one of his most influential essays, he articulated capitalism's core tactical nostrum as the shock doctrine. He observed that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And once crisis has struck, the University of Chicago professor was convinced that it was crucial to act swiftly to impose rapid and irreversible change before the crisis-racked society slipped back into the tyranny of status quo. Injuries should be inflicted all at once was his most lasting strategic legacy. Friedman first learned how to exploit a large-scale shock or crisis in the mid-70s when he acted as advisor to the Chilean dictator, General Augusto Pinochet. How do you say that? Pinochet or Pinochet?
Pinochet in Spanish.
Pinochet. Yeah, I'm trying to put French in there, am I?
I don't know what the origin of the word is. Might be.
General Augusto Pinochet. Not only were the Chileans in a state of shock following Pinochet's violent coup, but the country was then traumatized by severe hyperinflation. So Friedman advised Pinochet to impose a rapid-fire transformation of the economy in tax cuts, free trade, privatized services, cuts to social spending, and dysregulation for the private corporations. Eventually, Chileans saw their public schools replaced with voucher-funded private ones, and this is what happened in New Orleans after Katrina. Their private schools were all replaced with their public schools were all replaced with voucher-funded private ones. It was the most extreme capitalist makeover ever attempted anywhere, and it became known as a Chicago School Revolution, since so many of Pinochet's economists had studied under Friedman at the University of Chicago. And that's all we're touching on it right now. We're going to get into the absolute blood of this. Friedman predicted that the speed, suddenness, and scope of the economic shifts would provoke psychological reactions in the public that facilitate the adjustment. He coined a phrase for this painful tactic, economic shock treatment. And that's what's going to happen in North Carolina and LA, where the fires were. What do they want in North Carolina? They want the lithium in the Appalachians. And in LA, they want to put something big there where all the buildings were burned. So in the decades since, whenever governments have imposed sweeping free market programs, the all-at-once shock treatment or shock therapy has been the method of choice. Pinochet also facilitated adjustment with his own shock treatments. These were performed in the regime's many torture cells, inflicting on the writhing bodies of those deemed most likely to stand in the way of the capitalist transformation, inflicting severe trauma, torture on them. Many in Latin America saw a direct connection between the economic shocks that impoverished millions and the epidemic of torture that punished hundreds of thousands of people who believed in a different kind of society. As the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano asked, how can this inequality be maintained if not through jolts of electric shock? Exactly 30 years after these three distinct forms of shock descended on Chile, the formula emerged with far greater violence in Iraq. First came the war, designed, according to the authors of the shock and awe military doctrine, to control the adversary's will, perceptions, and understanding, and literally make an adversary impotent to act or react. And next came the radical economic shock therapy. When the Iraqis resisted, they were rounded up and taken to jails where bodies and minds were met with more shocks. These ones were distinctly less metaphorical, and they were brutal. The idea of exploiting crisis and disaster. This fundamentalist form of capitalism has always needed disasters to advance. In China, in 1989, it was the shock of Tiananmen Square massacre and the subsequent arrests of tens of thousands that freed the hand of the Communist Party to convert much of the country into a sprawling export zone, staffed with workers too terrified to demand their rights. In Russia in 1993, it was Boris Yeltsin's decision to send in tanks to set fire to the parliament building and lock up the opposition leaders that cleared the way for the fire sale privatization that created the country's notorious oligarchs. The Falklands War in 1982 served a similar purpose for Margaret Thatcher in the UK. The disorder and nationalist excitement resulting from the war allowed her to use tremendous force to crush the striking coal miners and launch the first privatization frenzy in a Western democracy. The NATO attacks on Belgrade in 1999 created the conditions for a rapid privatization in the former Yugoslavia, a goal that predated the war. Economics was not the sole motivator for these wars, but in each case, and I would disagree with that, I would say it was, a major collective shock was exploited to prepare the ground for economic shock therapy. In Latin America and Africa in the 80s, it was a debt crisis that forced countries to be privatized or die, as one former IMF official put it. So debt, right? And we've already talked about how that's not a moral. It's a moral that we've been taught, but it's not truly in the absence, in the presence of the sacred. It's not. There is no such thing as debt.
Mm-hmm.
What happened on September 11, 2001 in the U.S. is that an ideology hatched in American universities and fortified in Washington institutions finally had its chance to come home. The Bush administration immediately seized upon the fear generated by the attacks, not only to launch the war on terror, but to ensure that it was almost completely a for-profit venture, a booming new industry that has breathed new life into the faltering U.S. economy. And this is key, because in the Bible's creation story, it has God, this being, and I grew up believing this creation story. So I truly believed that heaven was a place somewhere out there, and there was this man, a literal man in human body up there in the sky. That was God, right? Mm-hmm. So here's this picture. Here's this man from the sky coming down to earth, forming a body like kids do with Play-Doh, and then doing CPR on it, basically, breathing into the breath of life. And so this is what these people think they're doing. But that's not. That's not how creation happened.
Mm-hmm.
Best understood as a disaster capitalism complex, it has much further reaching tentacles than the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned against at the end of his presidency. This global war is fought on every level by private companies whose involvement is paid for with public money, with the unending mandate of protecting the U.S. homeland in perpetuity while eliminating all evil abroad. What has emerged as the result of the Bush administration's particular brand of post 911 shock therapy is a fully articulated new economy. It was built in the Bush era, but it now exists quite apart from any one administration and will remain entrenched until the corporate supremacist ideology that underpins it is identified, isolated, and said, no more. We're not going to tolerate this. No more.
Mm-hmm.
The primary economic role of wars was a means to open new markets that had been sealed off and to generate post-war peacetime booms. Now wars and disaster responses are so fully privatized that they themselves are the new market, and there is no need to wait until after the war for the boom. The medium, the war, is the message. In this radical privatization of war and disaster, there's one problem that recurs. The ideology is a shapeshifter, forever changing its name and switching identities. Friedman called himself a liberal, but his U.S. followers tended to identify as conservatives, classical economists, free marketers, and later as believers in Reaganomics or laissez-faire.
Mm-hmm.
In most of the world, their orthodoxy is known as neoliberalism or free trade or simply globalization. More recently, we have neoconservative, a worldview that has harnessed the full force of the U.S. military machine in the service of a corporate agenda. All these incarnations share a commitment to the policy trinity: the elimination of the public sphere, total liberations for corporations, and skeletal government spending for good. A more accurate term for a system that erases the boundaries between big government and big business is corporatist. Its main characteristics are huge transfers of public wealth to private hands, accompanied by exploding debt and an ever-widening chasm between the dazzling rich and the disposable poor. Let me say that again, the disposable poor. With an aggressive nationalism that justifies bottomless spending on security. Other features of the corporatist system include aggressive surveillance, mass incarceration, shrinking civil liberties, and often torture. Tell me what country this is not true in.
Not a single one.
No. Torture in the CIA language, or is called coercive interrogation, is a set of techniques designed to put prisoners into a state of deep disorientation and shock in order to force them to make concessions against their will. The shock doctrine mimics this process precisely, attempting to achieve on a mass scale what torture does one-on-one in the interrogation cell. The clearest example was the shock of September 11, 2001, which for millions of people exploded the world that was familiar and opened up a period of deep disorientation and regression that the Bush administration expertly exploited. A new army of experts instantly materialized to write new and beautiful words on the receptive canvas of America's post-trauma consciousness. These words were clash of civilization, axis of evil, Islamofascism, homeland security. I remember all those words distinctly. With everyone preoccupied by the deadly new culture wars, Bush administration was able to pull off what it only could have dreamed of doing before then: wage privatized wars abroad and build a corporate security complex at home. Milton Friedman's brand of radical capitalism became government orthodoxy in almost every corner of the globe. This fundamentalist form of capitalism has consistently been midwifed in the most brutal forms of coercion, inflicted on the collective body politic as well as on countless individual bodies. The rise of corporatism was and still is being written in shocks. Rooted in the biblical fantasies of great floods and great fires, it is a logic that leads effortlessly to violence. Believers in the shock doctrine are convinced that only a great rupture, like a flood, a war, a terrorist attack, a fire in LA, can generate the kind of vast, clean canvas that they crave. So there's two people who have fathered this torture. the two shock doctors. Number one was Ewan Cameron, the CIA and his maniacal quest to erase and remake the human mind. Ewan Cameron was trying to build a model country by erasing people and then trying to remake them from scratch. He was a psychiatrist in Montreal in the 1950s, and he was paid by the CIA to perform bizarre experiments on his psychiatric patients. And we're not going to go into the stories of what he did, because the stories of what he did are going to be replayed in Chile and Bolivia and Argentina, and those are the stories we're going to tell.
Okay.
Some of the bizarre experimentation was to keep them asleep and in isolation for weeks, then administering huge doses of electroshock as well as the experimental drug cocktails like LSD and PCP. Did you know, to anyone watching, that in the 1950s, the CIA took a plane, Stanley Gottlieb, the founder of MK Ultra, took a plane, flew it over Kansas City, Missouri, and sprayed the whole city with LSD.
I didn't know that.
I did not know that either. I just found that out.
And what was his reason?
To see how they were all looking for mind control, because this was all in the Cold War. That oh my God, Russia's going to invade us and do terrible things because they're communists. So the experiments reduced his patients to pre-verbal infantile states. Some other experiments he used were huge doses of insulin, which drops your blood sugar, which would induce comas. And then he would use strange combination of uppers and downers with 8 times as many electroshocks as was standard at the time. Not one of his patients was ever able to function as a normal human being ever again.
Wow.
His ambition was not to mend or repair his patients, but to recreate them using a method he invented called psychic driving. According to his published papers, he believed that the only way to teach his patients healthy new behaviors was to get inside their minds and break up old pathological patterns. So the first step was depatterning, which had the stunning goal of trying to return the mind to a state that he thought a primordial state of blankness, like a writing tablet on which yet nothing is written. He doesn't realize that doesn't exist. He did not realize, right? But we have this. It's the same thing. We have this idea that when Columbus came to America, all he found was this pristine wilderness. There's nothing pristine in nature. Nothing pristine in nature. Everything fucks everything up. I mean, right? The wind blows leaves around, the animals move leaves. There's nothing pristine in nature, but we have this need for this pristineness, and this is what drove him.
Mm-hmm.
A pristine mind, and it drove Milton Friedman too. We're going to get into that. Cameron believed he could reach that state by attacking the brain with everything known to interfere with its normal functioning, all at once. It was a shock and awe warfare on the mind. And once his complete depatterning had been achieved, the psychic driving could then begin, and he would play them messages like affirmations that he recorded for 16 to 20 hours a day. In one case, he played a message continuously for 101 days. And CIA researchers, he was already doing this, and they became interested in his methods at the start of the Cold War hysteria. And the agency had just launched a program devoted to researching special interrogation techniques for mind control purposes. First, it was codenamed Project Bluebird, then Project Artichoke, and then finally it was renamed MK Ultra. 80 institutions were involved in this, including 44 universities and 12 hospitals, and Ewan Cameron was happy to participate. And MK Ultra is now MK Ultra 5.0, and it is in South America through the Brain Health Initiatives and since 2013 under Obama. It's in Central and South America in what's known as the Centers of Excellence. Mm-hmm. That is MK Ultra mind control.
Mm.
In 1988, the New York Times ran an investigation into U.S. involvement in torture and assassination in Honduras. Florencio Caballero, an interrogator with Honduras's notoriously brutal Battalion 316, told the Times that he and 24 of his colleagues had been taken to Texas and trained by the CIA. The techniques they used came from Ewan Cameron's work. Inez Burillo, a 24-year-old prisoner in Honduras who was interrogated by Caballero and his colleagues, told the Times that she was electrocuted so many times she screamed and fell down from the shock. The screams just escape you, she said. I smelled smoke and realized I was burning from the singes of the shock. They said they would torture me till I went mad, and I didn't believe them. And then they spread my legs and stuck wires on my genitals.
Man.
I told you we're going to go into the dirty nitty gritty. It's revolting, it's gut wrenching, but we have to any listeners, if it offends you, I'm sorry, but hopefully it'll make you wake up enough to say no more of this.
Mm-hmm.
The CIA has a manual called Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation that comes from Ewan Cameron's work and many others that experimented. The handbook claims that if the techniques are used properly, they will take a resistant source and destroy the capacity for resistance. The handbook also states that use of force, mental torture, threats, insults, or exposure to unpleasant and inhumane treatment of any kind as an aid to interrogation is prohibited by law, both international and domestic. It says that, but yet then it goes on and teaches them how to do it. So if anyone asks, the U.S. agents were tutoring their developing third world students in modern professional policing methods, and they couldn't possibly be responsible for excesses that happened outside their classes. On September 11, 2001, the longtime insistence on plausibility, deniability went out the window, and the Bush regime dared to demand the right to torture without shame. The Bush administration dealt with the problem of criminal prosecution by changing the laws. Donald Rumsfeld, empowered by George Bush, decreed that the prisoners captured in Afghanistan were not covered by the Geneva Convention because they were enemy combatants, not POWs. One of the first people to come face to face with this was a U.S. citizen and former gang member named Jose Padilla. Arrested in May 2002 at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, he was accused of intending to build a dirty bomb. Rather than being charged and taken through the court system, he was classified as an enemy combatant, which stripped him of his rights. Taken to a U.S. Navy prison, he says he was injected with what he believes was either LSD or PCP, probably both, and subjected to intense sensory deprivation. He was kept in a tiny cell with the window blacked out and not allowed to have a clock or calendar. Whenever he left the cell, he was shackled, his eyes covered with blackout goggles, and sound was blocked with heavy headphones. He was kept under these conditions for 1,307 days without right to a trial or anything. And he was forbidden contact by anyone except his interrogators, who, when they questioned him, blasted his starved senses with lights and pounding sounds. He was finally granted a court hearing in December 2006, and the dirty bomb charges were dropped. Are we okay with this? There was little he could do because the Cameron-style regression techniques had completely succeeded in destroying the adult he once was. The fact that he had a trial makes his case extraordinary. A trial after 4 years of torture, 1,300 days of torture, makes his case extraordinary. There are thousands of prisoners being held in U.S.-run prisons who are not U.S. citizens and have been put through a similar torture regime with no public accountability of a trial. Many languish in Guantanamo Bay. Mamdouh Habib, an Australian who was incarcerated there, has said that Guantanamo is an experiment. Guantanamo Bay is an experiment in brainwashing. Cameron's work was a spectacular failure in that he couldn't rebirth or remake the people, his patients, into model citizens. He was a genius at destroying people, but he could not remake them. His psychic driving did not work, and 75% of his patients never lived a life of any quality again. He was sure that if he blasted away at the habits and patterns and memories of his patients, he would eventually arrive at that pristine blank slate state with them. The opposite proved true. The more he blasted, the more shattered they became. Disaster capitalists share the same inability to distinguish between the destruction and creation, between hurting and healing. The other Dr. Shock, Milton Friedman, the search for his laissez-faire laboratory, which became Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay, Brazil. The University of Chicago's economics department in the 1950s was a place intensely conscious of itself as a school of thought. It was not just training students, it was building and strengthening the Chicago School of Economics, the brainchild of a coterie, however you say that, of conservative academics whose idea represented a revolutionary bulwark against the dominant statist thought thinking of the day. This department was in the thrall of an ambitious and charismatic man named Milton Friedman. His mission, like Cameron's, resting on a dream of reaching a blank state of natural health before human interferences created distorting patterns. Where Cameron dreamed of returning the mind to a pristine state, Friedman dreamed of de-patterning societies, of returning them to a state of pure capitalism. This is what I'm telling you. He cooked up this idea that, remember this creation story, this biblical creation story that has this mean God Stannis playing in the dirt, creating a human, breathing the breath of life into them. And now they live, and all of a sudden after this, now women give birth through their vaginas instead of jumping out of Adam's side fully formed, because that was the next step, right? So he created this pure capitalism concept and thought that he could breathe breath of life into it, because that's the story in the Bible. God breathed in this human being that was laying on the ground, gave him CPR, breathed in the breath of life into him, and voila, he was awake and living. So this is their thinking. In the absence of the sacred, this is their thinking, that they could create these stories, breathe, do CPR in them, and they'd become living beings. Pure capitalism, cleansed of all interruptions, government regulations, trade barriers, and entrenched interests. Like Cameron, he believed that when, in this case, the economy, which is not a human, which is not a living thing, it's just a story, was distorted, the only way to deliberately inflict was to inflict painful shocks or bitter medicine that could clear those distortions and bad patterns out of the way. Cameron used electricity to inflict his shocks, while Friedman's tool was policy. Unlike Cameron, who was instantly able to apply his theories on unsuspecting patients, Friedman would need 2 decades before he got the chance to put his creation into action. One of the founders of the Chicago School of Economics thought that professors should inculcate in their students the belief that each economic theory is a sacred feature of the system, not a debatable hypothesis. And everything in the world except for the laws that govern us is a debatable hypothesis. This is what we have to remember. Everything is a debatable hypothesis. The core of such sacred Chicago teachings was that the economic forces of supply, demand, inflation, and unemployment were like the forces of nature, fixed and unchanging. First of all, is there anything in nature that's fixed and unchanging? No. But this is what I'm telling you. They honestly believe they have this creation, and if they do CPR on it and breathe the breath of life into it like God did, in the Bible's creation story, it will become a living being. The only way it becomes a living being, quotes, a living being, is by the humans who believe it. Right? So in the truly free market imagined in Chicago classes and texts, these forces existed in perfect equilibrium. Supply communicating with demand the way the moon pulls the tides. This is what I'm telling you. This is in the absence of the sacred. They think they can do this bullshit creation story that's an absolute lie, absolute non-truth, right? And it becomes living. If economics suffered inflation, it was, according to Friedman's strict theory of monetarism, invariably because misguided policymakers had allowed too much money to enter the system, rather than letting the market find balance. The market's a truly human-created commodity. It can't find balance because it's controlled by humans. It's not nature. It's not Mother Earth. There's no yin-yang in the market. I'm sure a Chinese philosopher could tell you, oh, this is yin and yang. You can distort things anyway. You can try to inject the sacred into something that it won't fit in.
Mm-hmm.
So he was convinced that just as natural ecosystems keep themselves in balance, the market, left to its own devices, they see the market as a living being, would create just the right number because they breathe the breath of life into it, of products at precisely the right prices, produced by workers at the right wages to buy those products. An Eden of plentiful employment, boundless creativity, and zero inflation. This love of an idealized system is the defining quality of radical free market economics. Capitalism is envisaged as a celestial clockwork. When Europe was rebuilt after the Second World War, the Western powers embraced the principle that the market economics needed to guarantee enough basic dignity that disillusioned citizens would not go looking for more appealing ideology, whether fascism or communism. It was this pragmatic imperative that led to the creation of almost everything that we associate today with the bygone days of decent capitalism. Social security in the US, public health care in Canada, welfare in Britain, workers' protections in France and Germany, and whatever in Latin America, right? A similar, more radical mood was on the rise in the developing world under the name developmentalism, or third world nationalism. Developmentalist economists argued that their countries would finally escape the cycle of poverty only if they pursued an inward-oriented industrialization strategy instead of relying on the export of natural resources to Europe and North America. They advocated regulating or even nationalizing oil, minerals, and other key industries so that a healthy share of the proceeds fed a government that led developmental progress. The most advanced laboratory of developmentalism was the southern tip of Latin America, known as the Southern Cone. Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and parts of Brazil. The epicenter of this was the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, based in Santiago, Chile, and headed by an economist named Raul Prebisch from 1950 to 1963. He trained teams of economists in developmentalist theory and dispatched them as policy advisors for governments across the continent. Nationalist politicians like Argentina's Juan Perón put their ideas into practice, pouring money into infrastructure and giving local businesses subsidies to build their factories, and keeping out foreign imports with forbiddingly high tariffs. During this dizzying period of expansion, the Southern Cone began to look more like Europe and North America. The workers in factories formed powerful unions that negotiated mid-class salaries, and their children studied at the newly built public universities. The yawning gap between the region's polo club elite and its peasant masses began to narrow. By the 1950s, Argentina had the largest middle class on the continent, and the next door Uruguay had a literacy rate of 95% and offered free healthcare to all its citizens. Developmentalism was so staggeringly successful for a time, the Southern Cone of Latin America became a potent symbol for poor countries around the world. And it made for very dark days at the University of Chicago School of Economics. And that's where I quit writing, as I hadn't had any more time to get back to that. But so we have this brilliant picture of Argentina and Chile, right? That there's the gap between moneyed people and poverty is lessening there.
Mm-hmm.
And then Pinochet, backed by Milton Friedman, rolls in, and we're going to tell.
And creates the shock. Oh, man. Well, I had my recounts of that from my family having lived that. So I have something in me that tells me that remembers that.
Right. But we can't just let this be written out of history. Until enough of us have revolted to say no more of this. We're building a whole new system, and that's what we're doing with capitalism.
And that's what I tell my mom, who is the one that lived it more than me, is you gotta do something. You can't just stay there and allow yourself to be robbed even more by the.
Yeah.
I mean, at least she quit her job, the job she used to have, because it was getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
Well, more exploited.
Lesser pay, more exploitment. Lesser pay, more exploitment.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. That's what we're going to show, and then we're even going to show how the worst part about it was the human rights movement came in at that time. So we have human rights totally separated from the economic side. So the Chicago boys got away with it, killing more people than Hitler did.
Yeah.
And they still are doing it. They're fixing to do it in North Carolina. They're fixing to do it in LA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing what they can do.
And we just say, oh, it's progress.
Yeah, it's crazy. And
all our spiritual teachers are like, money is energy. Money is just energy. So you need to charge. Like Dr. Violdo, this shamanism is Harvard level education. So you're going to pay me $13,000 to study for 30 days. And I'm only going to give you access to this material for the 30 days while you're studying with me. And then you're going to go out and be a shaman and charge $400 an hour when you don't know what the fuck you're doing, because you don't have a clue why you're doing what I taught you to do.
Yeah. Pretty bad, huh? Pretty
right, because money's just energy. No, this is like I told you. I have struggled and I have struggled and I have struggled with this because I know I need money in this day and age. I know I need money. I need more money than I have. And that sounds like I'm coming from lack. I'm not. I'm manifesting. It's money's coming, but it hasn't showed up yet because I haven't been able to find peace with this.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that I believe money is evil. It's just right. How do I? And it finally hit me the other day. This is why I've been hammering on this all evening. This creation story from the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
This is where they honestly believe, and all our spiritual gurus agree with them. They created that God created this human being out of mud and then did CPR and breathed the breath of life into him. So mankind can create money and breathe the breath of do CPR on money and the right, so to speak, and breathe the breath of life into it. Now it's a living system of energy. No, it's not. It has no yin yang in it.
Mm.
The orgasmic energy, the chi, the munai ki, the force of life.
Mm-hmm.
Sacred presence. It has none of that in it. So it is not energy. It is simply a tool.
That's it. And so we continue diving into the absence of the sacred. So,
Through as seen through the shock doctrine, the capitalist shock doctrine.
so we'll have that for a fifth session
Oh,
of
yes, it's
Into
going
the
to take.
Abyss of Darkness in the absence of the sacred. Fifth session, going into the shock doctrine, these things that happened in the dictatorships of South America and Central America, and how it's replicated. I was not replied,
Yeah.
replicated throughout the world, and it's shocking, really, really, really shocking.
And you can say, well, we don't need that because that was the 70s. This is now, it's not still happening. And my answer to that is Guantanamo Bay still open?
What happened in LA? What is happening in the
Does
Amazon?
the US have the world's largest incarceration population? How do we know what's going on? None of us know. What about the detention centers?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening to the detainees that are, as we heard Trump so proudly declare, they're fucking criminals because they broke our laws by crossing the border.
Mm.
So it's criminal to want to feed your family.
Mm-hmm. And it's really bad, and there's even worse things I'm pretty sure that are happening.
Oh yeah.
And there's no place where nothing is like everything's in peace.
No,
like
there's
somebody here thinks, oh well, all right, where I'm at, there's nothing happening. Well, take a closer look,
is
because
there a prison close to where you're at?
take a closer look. Go out in the street, and I bet they know. And I bet they will understand why we're doing this. The very few that's are daring to, because it's got to be. I mean, you got to be brave and strong to want to get out of your bubble and actually, hey, you know what? You're right. This is what's happening, and I'm glad that you have a project, that you have a proposal to do something, and that you have been trying to do something and trying to figure it out for all this time. So that's what we're trying to do, and that's always the invitation
That's what we're doing.
Is to join us, do this, and join forces and be a hero in this mission.
A revolutionary hero. Remember, we have in this year of the wood snake, it goes with the 49th hexagram of the I Ching, which is abolishing the old.
It's
the revolution.
And in all this ugliness, that's what's beautiful. That's what the beauty is. We're still finding a way to channel our energy, our love, and that we're not falling for the same old bullshit.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that, shall we close the session?
Yeah.
Okay. So see you folks next week for the continuation of this conversation. Waterfalls of Blessings. See you next week.